We have made it to the last and final episode of our Debunking Inflammation series. And I feel like the topic that we're going to cover today is where inflammation gets its bad reputation from. It's what makes it part of the misunderstood mean girl club with cortisol. So we're going to dive in today. We're going to debunk it. We're going to really figure out systemic full body inflammation and what to do about it. Welcome back to Wellness Big Sis the Pod. I'm your host, Dr. Kelsey Vick, a board certified orthopedic doctor of physical therapy, a pelvic floor physical therapist, and the owner and founder of the Ella Wellness Sisterhood. And if this is your first episode joining us, we have been covering a few just topics that I feel like are very misunderstood and presented in such a negative light. We did cortisol already. I believe that was a 3 or 4 episode series. And now we're covering inflammation because all of the content and all of the education we receive about inflammation is about how negative it is for us, how we always need to decrease it. Same thing with cortisol. So my goal is to really teach and educate why we have inflammation, why we have cortisol when we did the Debunking Cortisol series, what benefits and what roles it plays within our body, and what we can do about it in order to help better manage inflammation. So episode 1, we covered inflammation basics, all about the inflammatory process. Episode 2, we covered local inflammation, so inflammation at various tissue types. So we did muscle tissue, skin tissue, and then gut health tissue, which is smooth muscle. Episode 3, we covered inflammation and our menstrual cycle. And then this last and final episode of the series, we cover systemic full body inflammation that I do feel like is where inflammation gets its bad reputation from. So my whole goal for today is to show what the contributors are to systemic inflammation, to full body inflammation, and what we can do about it in order to help better manage systemic inflammation within our own bodies and really help to promote our bodies into that overall healing, repair, regeneration phase of the inflammatory process. So as a reminder, inflammation is the way our body protects us. So as we've talked throughout this whole process, inflammation is necessary for so many different things, but when it comes to full body inflammation, it is the way that our body tries to protect us. So at the root cause, at the core being of inflammation, it helps to know that its sole purpose is to protect us. If our body senses something is harming us or something might harm us, that's when the inflammatory process ensues so that it can help protect us and can help us ultimately heal, repair, and regenerate from whatever it is sensing is going to harm us. So if you struggle with full body systemic inflammation, I do feel like it helps to keep that primary goal of inflammation in mind, to give your body a little bit of grace because it is doing its best. When it comes to full body inflammation, the reasons for it can be multifactorial, so it can be very frustrating to try and figure out the root cause. But at the end of today's episode, I'm going to give you guys my tips and tricks for ways to help solve the reason that you are experiencing this low-grade systemic inflammation throughout your whole body. And as a little bit of a vocab lesson, I try and use the word systemic inflammation and full body inflammation interchangeably so that you guys know systemic does mean full body, but if I forget, just know I'm talking about the same thing. Local inflammation is within the tissue, very region specific. Systemic is more full body. So if I mess up those, interchange those words throughout today's episode, just know they mean the exact same thing. Systemic means full body and local is more region specific. So in general, the basics of inflammation, our body senses a stressful stimuli, whether that's an infection, trauma, exercise, whether that's an allergen, some sort of an invader, our body senses that stress. So anything that puts our body under stress can cue that inflammatory process. That can be a lack of oxygen, that can be a hormonal drop, again, that can be a bacteria, some sort of toxin. It can be so many different things, which is why finding the root cause of full body inflammation can be so challenging and so daunting. But any of these things sensed throughout the body can cue our bodies into that inflammatory response. And it doesn't have to be this major inflammatory response. A lot of the time, systemic inflammation is just this chronic, low-grade level of inflammation that is sustained over time, and it never really grows out of that pro-inflammatory state to that anti-inflammatory state that we want. So that's where some of the problems arise. But in general, inflammation is started in order to protect us because of a stimuli that our body senses that might harm our bodies overall. So some of the causes of systemic inflammation can be an infection. It can be chronic diseases like obesity, like diabetes, like cardiovascular disease, like autoimmune issues. And again, if we have any of these underlying chronic diseases, a lot of times if our body senses a harmful stimuli on top of that, the inflammatory response can be lengthened because our body is already in this sort of heightened protective state because of this chronic disease. It can also be caused by stress. That can be physical stress like exercise, but that can also be psychological stress. So if we're not properly managing that, again, that can be this sort of low-grade cause for systemic inflammation and something that can be built upon. Again, if we have this heightened level of stress with an autoimmune condition, like it's just some of these variables can be thrown in together in order to create this sustained response and the sustained inflammatory response. Poor diet, poor hydration, again, not fueling our bodies in the right way, eating too much of a certain food, processed food, alcohol, whatever that is, that can also cause this systemic low-grade inflammation. And again, a lot of the time, if it does come down to our diet and our food, we're eating that day to day. So it's presenting that harmful stimuli to our bodies over and over again, which can again create that sort of low-grade inflammatory response. And then lastly, this one's probably the most frustrating for me, but environmental toxins can contribute to this low-grade full body inflammation. And same thing with diet. A lot of these environmental toxins we are presented with day to day. And so we're never truly removing that stimulus. So we're always sort of resetting and restarting that inflammatory response anytime we come into contact with these toxins within our environment. So how do these causes affect our body at each different system? So our cardiovascular system is affected with this low-grade systemic inflammation. So our cardiovascular system, our heart is a pump, and it works with our lymphatic system, with our detox system, with all of these systems in our body in order to help clear out the liquid, pump new good nutrients into the areas and the organs and the systems that need it. And so if we have this heightened immune response, our cardiovascular system is going to be affected because it's going to be working in overdrive in order to help our bodies clear out whatever that invader or toxin is. Our gut health is affected. So our smooth muscle contractile properties are affected. There can be permeability within the digestive tract. So molecules sneaking in that might not need to be there or that might not be able to be properly digested in a certain area. We can have poor food motility within the digestive tract. So our food doesn't move along as it should. Poor contractile capabilities. So our gut health is definitely affected and our digestion is definitely affected with the systemic low-grade inflammatory response. As far as the musculoskeletal system goes, we can experience joint pain, fatigue, poor recovery. We can have impaired contraction of muscles when we do exercise. So all of these things can be a response to this systemic inflammation within our bodies. For our metabolism, we can have impaired insulin sensitivity. And again, we want to be sensitive to insulin. We want our bodies to be able to respond to insulin, or else we might have too much blood glucose within our system. Our body might not be able to properly store or utilize that glucose. And again, all of these things are associated with type 2 diabetes, which can feed back into that low-grade systemic inflammation because diabetes is one of those chronic diseases that can cue that inflammatory process. Our nervous system can be affected, impaired communication within our nervous system between different regions, and inflammation, this low-grade systemic inflammation is also associated with neurodegenerative diseases like Parkinson's and Alzheimer's. So I know this is all scary, which I'm trying to present inflammation in a way to decrease the fear surrounding it, but it is true that sustained inflammation can result in a lot of these different things at a multi-system level. But there are ways that we can help address this, and there are things to look for to help us better manage the overall inflammatory load that our body has to deal with on a day-to-day basis. So from a fueling, diet, and nutrition standpoint, again, we hear it all the time, but less processed foods, less alcohol, and less of, I mention it as whatever stimulus your body is trying to fight. So for someone that might be dairy, for someone that might be gluten, for someone that might be a nut allergy, whatever it is, your body might not handle ingredients the same way that someone else's body does. And then your body will sense that as a harmful stimulus and create that inflammatory response in order to help heal from that stimulus. From a stress management standpoint, again, lower your stress is such a thrown around term, and it's so hard. So I acknowledge that me saying have better stress management to control your inflammation is not the most helpful thing, but this is why we do a lot of breath work. I'm so invested in teaching everyone how to breathe properly, how to access their parasympathetic nervous system properly, because it can all help us manage our overall stress and therefore our overall inflammation within our bodies. So this is a tip for helping to incorporate more meditation, mindfulness, breath work strategies throughout your day, but set an alarm, put it in your calendar, and actually do it. Even if it's a 15-minute time block, do 5 minutes within that 15 minutes and really just set an alarm, because I know it's one of the first things to get deleted from my calendar if I don't have time, but it is also one of those things that can really help when it comes to stress management and, again, this full body inflammation. Now, I'm not sure why I didn't mention this one first, but sleep is probably the most important thing you can do to help manage stress, to help your body allot certain resources to certain areas, to clean, to detox, to really help the body heal. Sleep is like of utmost importance. So I should have mentioned this one first, because if there was a category that I feel like most people need to clean up, it is probably sleep first, because the payoff is so much greater than the effort that you have to put in order to clean up your sleep hygiene and sleep environment. So we covered sleep and all of the benefits of good sleep and the benefits of the detoxification that happens during sleep in a spring cleaning episode we did in the spring. So I will link those episodes below for you guys to go back to, learn about the lymphatic system, how all of the gunk that builds up in our brain is cleaned during sleep. So sleep, again, can really help fight against some of those neurodegenerative diseases that are associated with that chronic low-grade inflammatory response. One of my absolute favorite ways to manage this low-grade inflammation is through exercise. And I know that seems counterintuitive, because exercise does have an acute inflammatory response, right? Within the muscles, we want that inflammation in order to help build back muscle from whatever micro tearing happened during the exercise that we expect with the right stimulus and the right load. So it's a fine balance, because a lot of the time when people they don't respond well to exercise, it's really because their body is having a hard time coming down from that sympathetic, that heightened cortisol state into this parasympathetic rest, digest, muscle recovery state. And so this is why a proper warm up and a proper cool down is of utmost importance, and why we always incorporate them within our workouts as part of the sisterhood, especially that cool down. Because again, we expect that heightened nervous system activity during exercise. We want that. That's exactly what we want. We want that inflammation when we exercise, and then again, a little bit of time afterwards, in order to help us rebuild back up those tissues that we stressed during exercise. But we really want to also be able to cue our bodies into that parasympathetic rest, digest, muscle recovery state after. And a lot of the times when people say they struggle with exercise or feeling good in their bodies after exercise, it's because that balance is off, or that ability to flip the switch and transition more to a parasympathetic dominance. That's where the discrepancy lies. And so we always do a parasympathetic activation after all of our workouts, because I know that so many people struggle with this. But if you do think you are one of those people that struggles with exercise and how your body heals after exercise, and you feel like exercise might be a stimulus for this low-grade inflammation, I have a few tips. And again, try some, see, it's an adaptable process, right? It's experimental, but shorten the workouts. You do not have to do 7 days a week of an hour workout. Shorten the workouts, shorten the weight, and lengthen the time in between workouts so that you're giving your body time to recover. It's a way to say thank you for allowing me to lift the weights, to do that hill sprint workout that I was supposed to do. Now I'm going to give you enough time to recover, because I know right now you are struggling to recover. You're struggling to go from that inflammatory response to that anti-inflammatory response that we want as that sort of healing process, muscle building process continues. And so don't be afraid to shorten the workouts, lighten the weights, decrease or increase the time in between workouts, because again, that's only going to help give your body the safety and the reassurance that exercise is good, exercise is helpful, and that you can go from this inflammatory process of exercise to this anti-inflammatory process that we want during the recovery. And then the last one, again, environmental toxins. This one is very challenging for me, but limiting the chemicals within our environment, whether that's the candles we use, the perfumes that we use, limiting our exposure to toxins, whether that's in our makeup products or shampoo or water quality. And then I know this is so challenging because this is very challenging for me, and it can be its own challenge within itself, let alone trying to address all of these factors that go into systemic inflammation. So one of my biggest tips for controlling environmental toxins is to start small, start with what you can control, start with the variable in your environment that you can control, and then build up from there. So what are some of the ways that I can tell if my body is in this low-grade inflammatory state because of its constant exposure or constant fight against a certain invader or toxin or stressful circumstance or just this sensed stress within our body? So there are definitely some blood tests that you can do. They measure certain markers like interleukin 6 and then also C-reactive protein, so CRP. But these are not the first things I would recommend because I think it's a little bit of overkill. I don't think we all need to do this. I think a lot of us just need to be better aware and listen to our bodies a little bit better. And there are some tools that can help with that. So I have talked about this before, but I love my Aura Ring for just sensing how much stress my body's under. It measures resting heart rate, it measures body temperature, it measures overall recovery. So I know that in general, if my resting heart rate's high, if my body temperature is elevated, if my heart rate variability is low, where I'm not able to switch between that sympathetic and parasympathetic as quickly, I know my body's under a little bit more stress. And so it allows me to take that information and then adapt my routine for it. So if my body is in this super heightened, stressful state, there's no use in me doing a super hard, super heavy exercise or super heavy workout on top of that because I know my body's going to struggle to recover from that. So maybe I incorporate more mindfulness breathwork strategies. So using some sort of tracker, it doesn't have to be the Aura Ring, but I love the Aura Ring for it. You can even do this free and just objectively, like measuring your resting heart rate at the same time throughout the day, your body temperature, getting sort of an objective measure on your sleep. So from 1 to 10, how did I sleep tonight? And using those trends over time to create sort of this response to your overall stress level day to day. And then lastly, I have on here, try to control the variables, the causes of that low-grade inflammation bit by bit. Chip away at it. Again, it's so hard to control all the variables all at once, especially when you're not quite sure what might be causing this low-grade inflammation. So my recommendation is start with your sleep hygiene. Really clean up that routine and then move on to the next. Okay, exercise. I notice I don't feel as good after exercise when I do this. Let me try this instead. And really sort of tweak and experiment with your certain routines in each of these categories and see how your body responds. It's usually not just one category either. It's usually, again, a multifactorial approach to control this systemic low-grade inflammation. And so it might take a little bit of time, a little bit of tweaking. So give yourself a little bit of grace, give your body a little bit of grace, knowing that this inflammatory response is in order to protect you. It's ultimately your body's way of saying, hey, I'm noticing something's going wrong. Let me do what I can to help you. We need to give ourselves the space and give ourselves the grace to realize that inflammation is good, it's beneficial, but we also need to be able to understand what might be contributing to that so that we can get out of that chronic cycle. So that is systemic inflammation, some of the causes, some of the reasons we have it, some of the responses that our body might go into if we are experiencing systemic inflammation, certain tests that we can do in order to figure out if we are under this super inflammatory load. And this is something I didn't mention, but something that is very important if you are a female and you are getting some of these blood tests and checking some of these objective measures to see whether or not you are struggling with sort of this full body inflammation and this low-grade inflammation. Our menstrual cycle plays a huge role, which was in the third episode as part of this series. So it is a very important contributor to inflammation and something that if you notice this cyclical pattern where you feel extra inflamed during certain periods or more fatigued or bloated or muscle pain or joint pain or whatever, check which phase you are in your cycle, because we can do certain things to affect that phase and to help our bodies while they are experiencing more inflammation during our cycles, but we also expect that during our cycles. So it might not be this bad thing that you need to control and that you need to fix. It just might be something to be aware of so that you can incorporate different variables and different foods, different behavior strategies like mindfulness, meditation, and breath work in order to help better manage the inflammation that is expected during that phase of the menstrual cycle. So same thing if you get the blood tests done or you've had those blood tests done, make sure you know what phase of your cycle you're in, because those variables can be affected by the phase that you're in your menstrual cycle. So the menstrual cycle plays a huge role, and I highly recommend checking out that third episode so that you can have a better understanding of your own menstrual cycle and the role inflammation plays within that, so that you're not thinking everything is a systemic full body inflammation that can be super scary and super hazy and super mysterious, because there's a lot of factors that go into it, but it can really just come down to the phase that you're in within your cycle. And again, some of those phases we expect inflammation, we want inflammation in order to healthily regulate our cycles. But I hope you guys learned a lot from this episode. Thank you so much for following along. Again, inflammation series done, debunked. Episode 1, all about the inflammation and the basics of the inflammatory process. Episode 2, we cover local inflammation within the skin, gut health, and muscle tissue. Episode 3, inflammation with the menstrual cycle, which again, highly recommend that episode. And then episode 4, this last and final one, about systemic inflammation. So I hope you enjoyed this series. If you missed the first 3, please go check them out, because they do build on each other, and the education provided in those can really give you a better, more full-rounded picture of inflammation systemically within your whole body. So thank you guys so much for joining. Thank you for listening. If you feel like a friend or family member would benefit from this episode, I'd appreciate it if you shared with them. If you liked, comment, subscribed, reviewed, it really, really helps us out. And again, I'm thankful for you guys. Thank you guys for listening, for following along. And I hope you are now better aware of inflammation and how it can benefit and affect your own body. So thank you guys for following along, and I'll see you guys again on the next Wellness Big Sis podcast episode.